Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding and idea about what we're gonna build, let's get to it. So if we used create next app to create a app, we'll actually get a boilerplate containing all the entire structure which we require. So if you're not familiar, we have the underscore app.tsx, which will be like our root component, and there is also an index.tsx, which will be our main route and our only route in this case. So yeah, so the first thing we have to do is to use chakra provider, import chakra provider and wrap our component, our entire component, literally the entire app, with chakra provider. So this is the only way we'll be able to utilize the styles provided by chakra UI. So that's out of the way. Next, let's go to index.tsx. So again, like I mentioned, if you use create next app to create it, there will be some default content and styling from Next.js to get started, some boilerplate code. So I've removed most of it and I've added my own things, like in the head tag I've added a title, a meta description, favicon that's there, and in the actual body or the main part I have added a heading, which you can see is start as faucet as we saw earlier. There is also a description that I have added, and the footer I have left it as the same, because shout out to Versil for creating Next.js, and yeah, it's pretty amazing. So yeah, that's it for the structure. Now let's get to the main part, which is this one, a faucet. This is where all the magic happens. So our entire app is literally inside this component. So I've defined it inside src components faucet. So this is our entire faucet that's there, and let's just go through it one by one. So this is the basic skeleton structure, you could say, of the faucet. So for instance, we have an input button which will let us to enter the address. We have a button to request for the airdrop, which we can click to request the airdrop, which is this one, and also a button to test the network, if it is testnet or devnet. So that is this slider button, which is again a custom component that I've made. This is also pretty simple. So there are basically like two buttons inside a container that I've added, and I've added styles of my own. And there are also two states that we added. So first one is the address. So address is added to keep track of our address that the user inputs, and we have added an on change event listener to this input, and whenever its value changes, we're going to just set the address into the whatever the value is. So we've actually made this as a control component to have a higher degree of control over it. And finally, we have one more state, which is testnet. Is testnet. So self-explanatory. If the user chooses the testnet, this will be true. If not, it will be false, which means they want to have the token set off from the devnet. So that is passed as a prop to our the slider button component, which is actually this one. So that's the structure. So now let's get started. So the first and foremost thing we have to do is to make sure that the address we enter is correct. So let's just define a function for that. Let's just call it validate Solana address, which will be an arrow function like so. Okay, so now we actually need help from Solana web3. So we have to import the public key class from Solana web3. So this public key class is what helps us to generate a public key out of a string, or do all things public key, like maybe even generate a uint18 representation of a public key or whatever. So let's complete this validate Solana address function, which we wrote earlier. So it will take in a parameter of address of type string, and what we have to do is, first of all, generate a public key from this address. So let's just define a variable called public key, which will be of type public key. Now inside a try catch block, because it can actually throw error sometimes, so just to make sure we catch everything correctly, and this is also going to console the error in case there is any. Alright, so right now inside this, what we're gonna do is public key equals new public key of address. So what we're doing is basically using this public key class, or literally we are generating a new public key out of this address string and assigning that to public key. Cool. Now what we have to do to check if we have a valid public key, we have a function called isOnCurve, which is on public key. So public key dot isOnCurve. isOnCurve takes in a parameter called an argument called a public key, which is of type a uint data array. So we can pass in public key. Since the public key is of type public key, it is not, you can see TypeScript throws an error. This is why I love TypeScript, it makes development way easier. So it says public key is not assignable to parameter of type uint data array. So what I have to do is uint data array dot 2 bytes, which will convert it into a uint data array, like a byte representation of a public key. So and this we can return this. So isOnCurve basically checks if the public key we passed in is on the ed25519 curve. So this is a particular format that every Solana address uses. So it will return true if it is an ed25519 curve. If not, it will return false. So it basically checks if the address is valid. And yeah, and in the error also we just return false, just for good measure. There we go. So we have that. Now every time we type in a new address, we can see that the address changes. So the best way to do this is with help of a use effect hook in React. So I'm just gonna write a use effect hook, the dependency parameter of address, and every time the address changes, we'll have the latest value of address captured here. And we're just gonna do, let's just declare a variable const is valid equal validate Solana address of address. And I'm also going to declare another state. So let me just call it, let's call it const is valid, maybe same, and set is valid, and this is going to be the state of, it's going to take in a boolean value. So yeah, and the idea behind this state is to check if the address is valid or not. So we're just going to set that to is valid. So every time if the address is valid, we're just going to set it to is valid. Basically that's all we're going to do. So there we go, that is it. So next thing we have to do is for the button. So as we can see, the button right now is enabled. So even if I don't have any address, or even if I have a wrong address, the button is enabled. So I'll have to disable the button in case if the address is not valid one. So it's going to say if not is valid, I'm going to disable that particular button. There we go. So unless I have a valid address now, I won't be able to request for the airdrop. So let's just test it out real quick. There we go. Now that I have copied pasted the valid address from my Phantom wallet, it works fine, and the airdrop button is enabled. So yeah, that's the validation part. In the next part, we'll actually get started with requesting for the airdrop one. So yeah, thanks for watching.